Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to Old Band, New Sound, Yay or Nay. Part 2. There was a part 1 of this video I had posted previously. You can check that out. I'm going to leave a link in the description for you. But basically the gist is that every band and artist likes to be hip, new, fresh, on top of the charts. I mean, who doesn't? And when bands start to fall from that, they will sometimes try to reinvent themselves. But the big question is, did it work? So join me as I run through 10 old bands that changed their sound, hoping to be popular again. I'll give my opinion, then you guys can weigh in and we'll all decide if this worked or didn't work. But before we get started here, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already clicked the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by subscribing, you'll stay up to date on really cool episodes just like this with old band, new sound, yay or nay. Now, the previous episode, we did letters A through J. We are going to pick up here with letter K and run through the rest of the alphabet. And first one up, Kiss. Formed in 1973, really cool hard rock band, doing the whole face paint thing and whatnot, pulling all the kids in through that. But while they kind of had that sort of a glam rock image, they were really just a straight ahead hard rock group, releasing, one of the all-time anthems in rock and roll all night. Big hit that came off of Alive. But in 77, they released my favorite album, Love Gun, which is a great straight up hard rock album. But by 1979, the band was really starting to change, go through changes and change its sound. And they put out 1979's Dynasty, the disco-influenced rock album. Now, I have to say, this is one of my all-time favorite albums. So even though it is a hugely different album than what they were doing early on with the straight-ahead hard rock stuff, I actually really like what they did to it. It just gave it a new, fresh element for the times. But then again, by the late 80s, they were changing again, putting out Crazy Nights, which was really more of a glam metal, pop metal sound from 87. And that didn't stop them there because they continued to make changes in through the 90s. And even though this one wasn't released at the time, probably would have come out around 1996, when Carnival of Souls came out in 1998 officially, this was a grunge sound, very down-tuned, dark album that didn't sound like anything they had done before. The thing is that I think if Carnival of Souls had been dropped in 95, 96, even though grunge was at the tail end and basically over by that point, I actually think it would have worked for the band. It never really had quite the right mix on it. I think it needed a different mix, and the band, I think, could have made it work for them. But unfortunately, it was a little too late in the game. They had already reformed, put the face paint back on, and nobody was really giving this one much of a chance at the time. But Kiss, being one of those bands that has constantly changed throughout its era, I think in all, they have somehow managed to, for it to work for them. You guys weigh in, let me know your thoughts. I'm sure there's some diehard Kiss fans out there that don't like anything past, the solo albums or Alive 2, that kind of a thing. But I like all of the eras of them. All right, next one up, a big debate one here, I think, Metallica, who formed in 1981. Pure, unadulterated, amazing thrash metal. One of the originators of it, sort of culminating with And Justice for All from 1988. This is a thrash masterpiece, in my opinion. And the one at least that brought them to so much attention because of the single One that came off their first music video at the time, that sort of a thing. But the next album, the Black Album, self-titled, 1991, was a mix of thrash and hard rock. So it started to move away from that full-on thrash sound that we had known them for. And while I think this album was okay and most people could bridge and come across with it, there are those diehards that sort of draw the line at the Black Album or just before it, kind of a thing. But, when they moved on and they did Load in 1996, and that one was really just hard rock and alternative rock. I mean, the thrash element was gone from that one. That was another one that just threw people for a loop, even though all of their albums have been successful, including 2003's Saint Anger, where they made the most abrupt change in sound. Well, this one here is metal, even with some more of the thrash element coming back into the fold after Load and Reload. This one here was basically a new sound all their own, and everyone will argue and debate that sound and that drum sound from Lars and so forth on it. Well, I do think there's a lot of good songs that are on here. They're just not presented right. The mix is horrible on this thing, and I have tried, and there are times when I want to hear it, but most cases, if I'm thinking Metallica, I am not going back to Saint Anger. So I don't think that one worked for them, but it did sell 2 million copies at the time. So did it work for them? I suppose it did, but I think that's just who Metallica are. Any other band would not have worked. All right, next one up, Motley Crue. 1981 they form, putting out, you know, metal and glam metal era style albums, culminating with Dr. Feelgood in 1989. One of the all-time best glam metal albums of the era. Huge for them, 6 million selling, lots of big hits off the album. Really kind of just defining who they are at that point, putting the capstone on everything. But unfortunately, Vince Neil's out of the band. They bring in John Corabi and release a self-titled album in 1994. This is darker, slower. It's got some down-tuned elements in it. But due to the time and the change in music and everything, I actually think it worked very well for them. And I think if they had continued on with John Corabi, I think that that could have worked for them. Problem is, they immediately did an about face. John Corabi is out of the band. They bring Vince back in. But instead of reverting to the sounds that made them popular from like Dr. Feelgood, they go and they make Generation Swine, putting it out in 1997 with samples, drum loops, even a grunge, you know, alternative rock style sound of this thing. And that did not work. I tried to get into that album, and there were elements of it. I liked the first single, Afraid, that came off it. I even liked a couple of the other songs like Glitter and Black Beauty that were released off of it. But just as a whole, it is slow. It doesn't have memorable moments. They're letting other people sing on it, like Nikki Sixx and Tommy Lee. It's just a mishmash that I don't think has a real identity to it. And unfortunately, they obviously realized it didn't either, because they make a complete about face trying to make the follow-up that should have been Dr. Feelgood after that New Tattoo, where I think they finally got back on track. But you guys let me know what you think in terms of these albums, of course. All right, next up, Pink Floyd, going in a completely different direction here. The band formed in 1965. Their debut album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, from 1967, psychedelic rock, 60s pop, very, very different than what they would become ultimately by 1973, with Dark Side of the Moon becoming full-on prog rock band with a very atmospheric vibe to it, something that not a lot of other bands have ever been able to capture and mimic in the same way that Pink Floyd are so defined at doing. So to go from a psychedelic 60s pop band into a prog rock band, these are very different, and obviously it has to do with the difference between frontman Syd Barrett on the debut and Roger Waters taking over and really coming into his own for Dark Side of the Moon, and David Gilmour being in there and the guitar playing that he brought to the band and so forth. But in this particular case, I think they're only better for it. The albums that came from 73 on are the defining elements of the band, and the ones that I love. For me personally, I've just never really seen the appeal that everybody lauds at Syd Barrett. It's okay for what it is, but it is not Pink Floyd for me. Okay, next up, Poison. Formed in 83, releasing this amazing album here, Open Up and Say Ah, in 1988. Glam metal, party metal, I mean, almost a sound unto themselves. They are really the kings of glam metal, what ultimately became hair metal. This is a band that is one that defined that moniker and so forth, with the makeup, the hair, and so forth. But they would go on, and by 1993, because the sounds of everything had changed, and they were interesting in the way that they moved. Instead of making a grunge era album like so many of their counterparts did, they went the opposite direction with Native Tongue, and in 93 with acoustic rock, more soul, bringing out that blues element that had always been an underlying tone and influence for them. And in this particular case, I think it worked wonders. Not many glam metal bands were able to come out changing their sound and still do amazing things. The album itself would still sell gold. Now, that's not the 2, 3, and 4 million copies and so forth that the previous albums had done, but I still think that it was a very good album. I go back to this one a lot. I still love it, so I think it worked, but you guys let me know your thoughts. Next up, REM, formed in 1980, doing the whole college rock, alternative rock scene and so forth, putting out a lot of great early on albums through the 80s and stuff, culminating with Green in 1988, still doing the college rock, alternative rock thing. But then, right after that, 1991, they put out For Time, where they still have the college rock, alternative rock thing, but now they've added pop, classical, folk music, and so forth. This is the one, though, that would really take the world by storm, and they just exploded. They'd become fairly big with Green, but this one just took them to a whole other level. So the change in sound here really worked. It was also the first album that I bought by the band, so it pulled me into it. Thing is, just 3 short years later, they put out Monster, 1994. This one here, returning them to that more alternative rock sound, but adding in loud, distorted guitar sound to the thing. And again, it worked. And it just showed that this band had so many multifaceted layers to them. And they were successful all the way around on this. Unfortunately, the band really wasn't able to hold on to that success, and they started the downturn thereafter. But all 3 eras of this band worked for them, and pretty amazing that they were able to do it. I don't know which one is your favorite era of the band, but I do think all 3 of these worked. Now, another band out of the 80s, an alternative rock band that made major changes and waves in their sound, was U2. They formed in 1976, culminating with Joshua Tree in 1987, their biggest album at the time, where they were new wave and alternative rock kind of merging, also that sort of college rock sound and so forth. You know, a critic's darling sort of band. Then they put out Rattle and Hum in 88, where they mix rock with blues, R&B, and soul and that sort. And surprisingly, that works really well for them too, going on to sell 5 million copies of that album. But did they continue that or revert back to Joshua Tree? No. They put out 1991's Achtung Baby, honestly its own style. It's like alternative rock dance album, if you will, using new sounds and styles and things, really creating a whole new thing for them. And they continue that on, modifying it ever so slightly more and more for the next 2 albums before kind of reverting back to that classic U2 sound going forward. But you've got 3 distinct eras of the band and sounds and so forth. And while for me, Rattle and Hum isn't something I go back to, and I think that it really kind of rode the coattails of Joshua Tree more than being its own standalone sound and album. But the difference between Joshua Tree to Achtung Baby is so night and day. I'm amazed that it even worked, but somehow it did. I initially would have said not going to work when I first heard Fly come off of it, but I grew to love it. So in the end of the day, I do have to say that it did work, not just financially for the band and critic-wise for the band, but in the end, I love going back to that sound as well. Okay, next one, Warrant. Formed back in 1984, put out some of the best glam metal albums of the late 80s into the early 90s there, culminating with Cherry Pie in 1990. Glam metal, pop metal, huge hit with that song, self-titled tune, Cherry Pie in and of itself, even though Janie Lane wanted the album to be called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a big hit in and of itself, showing that I think the band would have been just fine without the song Cherry Pie. But the 2 together really put the album over the top. And they would go on and shift the sound for Dog Eat Dog, becoming more of a metal band in there, but it still was a tie back to the glam metal thing enough that people could ride that and so forth. But by the time they got to 1996 and put out Belly to Belly, this one here was a full-on grunge album. And again, grunge was really over by 1996. They were just kind of the beggars and hangers on at that point, and so they really did it a little too late. Although this album here is not one I go back to. It's just angry, it's dark, it's not any of the characteristic that we loved from the band. The lyrical content is gone, the sound is gone, the style of singing is gone, and so in this particular case, I don't think it worked at all for them. And they've since returned really back to their classic sound. Unfortunately, though, Jenny Lane has since passed away. So we're never going to ever really get back to what we loved about that original glam metal sound. Next one, Whitesnake, formed in 1978. You know, David Coverdale forming the band, coming off of Deep Purple, carrying on that sound that was Deep Purple, with Deep Purple not being around. It was amazing what he did here with the early Whitesnake, putting out classic early albums like Ready and Willing in 1980 with that blues rock, boogie rock sound, mixing it in with the hard rock stylings that were going on. This one having the song Fool for Your Love and the original tune to it, although the band didn't break in the US at that time. They weren't really being marketed as such. Maybe a big mistake on the labels at the time and whatnot. But by 1987, or before that even, 84, they had been signed on by Geffen Records, and they were remarketed and essentially became a glam metal band, culminating in 87 with the self-titled album. And this one here just exploded, and really this is the band that coined and popularized the power ballad. There were versions of it before that and so forth, but this band is the one that made it huge. And after that, every band had to have the power ballad on their album and so forth. But here I'm able to go switch between the two because of David Coverdale's amazing, powerful voice throughout. He didn't lose the blues rock sound. They only amplified it on here. They just made more bombast and power behind it. But if you like the blues rock thing, while it's a little underdone on those earlier albums and maybe a little overdone for the albums of the 80s, it's all still the same thing. So for me at least, even though there's a big varying difference in that bombast, I still like it. I still think it works. But of course, you guys are going to have to weigh in on that. All right, and the last one we're going to talk about here, Yes, who formed in 1968 and didn't quite start off in the full-on prog sounds, but they got into it very quickly, especially with the fantastic album Fragile. But my favorite of them, Close to the Edge from 1972, full-on prog rock, only 3 songs on this album, you know, development of that album side track kind of a thing. But as they move through the 70s and eventually they break up and reform, by 1983 they release 90125, where this one here was simplified, radio-friendly prog rock. It was still complex music, but much more radio-friendly than that earlier stuff. And this is another one of those bands where I think if they had not modernized their sound, they would not have made it. They would have been considered dinosaurs and or have just, you know, quietly passed away, so to speak. So with the change in members and things of that, and you got Trevor Rabin coming in and bringing in those new songs and so forth, it only added to the benefit of it here. I think both versions of Yes work. They have short songs at different times in their careers, and they have more poppy versus long drawn out prog and so forth. So it works here whether you want a whole album of the full on prog or you want that more poppy sound, they've got it for you. But I love all of the Yes eras of the band, so it's not a hard one for me. But then again, I'm sure you guys got your opinions on it. You can certainly let me know. So there you go, 10 more bands, old ones that changed their sound. Question is, did it work? This was part 2. If you want to see part 1, I am going to leave a link in the description for it, and then you can watch all 20 bands as part of this discussion. And certainly weigh in, let me know your thoughts. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Take care, everyone, and I'll talk to you real soon. All right, bye-bye.